Happy New Year, Fantasy Points family. Look, technically it's not the new year as of yet. It's the Friday Night Hype Show here on Fantasy Points. I'm Matt Donnelly, and the new year technically does not kick off until Sunday when the NFL drops a 14-game slate. Either way, though, we are here to help you win those fantasy championships. It is championship week in fantasy football. This week, we are going to give you a little bit more insight into some of the premier matchups, including the Miami Dolphins versus the New England Patriots, the Carolina Panthers versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Minnesota Vikings versus the Green Bay Packers, and yes, that battle in the AFC North, the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Baltimore Ravens. But before we get into this week's slate of games, we got to talk about some notable injuries, and we got to talk about that Thursday night football game because I have to admit, I was expecting that game on Thursday Night Football with all the injuries to Tennessee, the players being pulled out of there, to kind of resemble a horror flick where it was going to be so bad, you knew what was going to happen, but you couldn't turn away from it. It actually turned out to be a lot better of a game than what I had thought. Now, some of these injuries going into week number 17, they're not as good as we had hoped they're going to be. And we've got some more injuries that I'm sure are going to sneak up on us here. Before we talk about these injuries, make sure to bookmark the Fantasy Points podcast there for all the latest injury updates ahead of week number 17 with Fantasy Points' very own DPT Edwin Porras. Now let's talk about some of these injuries. Lamar Jackson, he has not returned to practice. He's dealing with that PCL injury. Jalen Hurts, hey, he could come back on Sunday. I wouldn't bank on it as of yet. He's still dealing with that shoulder sprain. And hey, Gardner Minshew is still a pretty good quarterback. Tua Tagovailoa concussion, he is out. Teddy Bridgewater is in this week, and I don't know if we should expect Tua to come back before the playoffs, if he even comes back this season. Tyler Lockett limited there at practice there with that finger injury. We've also got Christian Watson, still has not taken the field as of Thursday, dealing with that hip flexor injury. Hopefully he's in those fantasy football lineups this week. Colt McCoy concussion. He looks like he's going to replace Trace McSorley, which gives fantasy managers a little bit of hope for DeAndre Hopkins and Marquise Hollywood Brown this week. Hunter Henry's dealing with a knee injury. Chris Olave looks like he's going to be good to go on Sunday, so let's keep an eye on that as well. Nico Collins doubtful with that foot injury. Deebo Samuel still dealing with that ankle injury and that MCL sprain. Chase Claypool still has that knee injury. Honestly, everyone's pretty much day-to-day. James Conner, he had an illness. He missed practice on Thursday. And just after tweeting about having to cook for himself, Stephon Diggs, he missed practice on Thursday due to an illness as well. Maybe it's related. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But let's talk about some of these other games before we talk about those premier matchups, starting with the Atlanta Falcons hosting the Arizona Cardinals. Now, I mentioned that Colt McCoy looks like he is cleared, which is a good thing because Arizona, Trace McSorley, he was a fantasy killer and not in a good way. Meanwhile, Tyler Algier is that dude that is going to help win someone a fantasy championship this week. Back-to-back 100 scrimmage yards games, facing against a Cardinals team that is allowing 35.7 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. Now, speaking of good games, how about the last 3 games for Drake London, in which he's averaging 10.7 targets, 6.7 receptions, 87 yards per game, and he's getting about a 54% receiving yardage share. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty good. Desmond Ridder, he loves himself some Drake London. Chicago at Detroit. Jared Goff at home, fire up the Lions this week in fantasy, especially DJ Chark, especially Amon-Ra St. Brown. For St. Brown in his last 16 healthy contests, he has gone on to an average of 22.7 fantasy points per game, averaging 10.8 targets. And that at home, those numbers are even better as his fantasy production increases to 24.4 fantasy points. Even after a tough matchup against the Jets, Chark is averaging over 100 yards per game over the last 3 contests, and he faces a Bears secondary that struggles at stopping the deep ball. So, hey, feel good about DJ Chark. That might be your stack to go with, a DFS stack. Jared Goff, DJ Chark, just going to throw that out there. Now, Jacksonville at Houston, the Texans have allowed just 426 yards and 2 touchdowns over the last 4 weeks to opposing wide receivers. That's bad news for Christian Kirk and Zay Jones. However, it's good news for Travis Etienne, who faces a Texans team that has surrendered 513 yards on the ground and 155 yards to backs in the passing game, along with 6 total touchdowns. Houston has also allowed the 4th most yards to tight ends in the last 4 games, and Evan Ingram has finished first, and third in targets over the last 3 contests, averaging 10.7 targets and 112.3 receiving yards per game in those 3 games. Now, Denver at Kansas City. Kansas City has won 10 consecutive contests against the Broncos with Patrick Mahomes under center. How good is Patrick Mahomes? He has 35 or more passing touchdowns and 4,500 or more passing yards for the fourth time in his career. He's only played 5 seasons. He joins Tom Brady. He joins Drew Brees there, Peyton Manning, as the only quarterbacks in NFL history to have at least 4 seasons of 35-plus touchdowns and 4,500 yards. Now, Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady, they share the record for the most seasons of 35-plus touchdowns in NFL history with 6. Patrick Mahomes already has 4 such seasons there in just 5 career seasons starting at the quarterback position. That's like 80% of his career. He's throwing 35-plus touchdowns. I mean, that's absolutely mind-boggling right now. Now, Indianapolis at the New York Giants. Is Richie James the new number 1 in New York? Since week 13, James leads this Giants team with a 21% target share compared to Isaiah Hodgins there, who's sitting at 20%. Darius Slayton, he's down to 19%. Last week, it was James who caught 8 of 12 targets there for 90 yards in a loss to the Vikings. New Orleans at Philadelphia. Will Hurts play? Will he not play? Philadelphia, essentially, they have that number 1 seed. They're on lockdown, and a win against the Saints, it actually improves the Eagles' draft position as the Eagles currently hold the Saints' first-round draft pick here in 2023. Hurts versus Minshew. This is important to follow for all those that are rostering Miles Sanders. With Jalen Hurts under center, Sanders sees just under 15 touches per game and just 2 red zone carries per. While Minshew, those opportunities, they jump up to 24.5 and 4.5 red zone carries per game. So if you got Miles Sanders, you're kind of hoping that Gardner Minshew gets a start this week. Cleveland at Washington. A pair of league winners this week could be in Washington as Brian Robinson faces a Browns run defense that has allowed 21.4 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. That's the 4th most in the NFL. And Jahan Dotson, who has posted more than 16 fantasy points in 5 of 6 games in which he's played at least 66% of the Commanders' offensive snaps. If the Commanders are in the red zone, expect Dotson to be targeted, especially now that Carson Wentz is back under center. Now, fun fact, last week, Carson Wentz took 44% of the Commanders' dropbacks, and Curtis Samuel scored 77% of his fantasy production on those Wentz dropbacks. San Francisco at Las Vegas. Not only is the car being parked in Las Vegas, it has been abandoned. That's right. Jared Stidham, Chase Gerbers, they are going to be the Raiders quarterbacks the rest of the season as the Raiders are looking to get some younger players, some looks here heading into the offseason. That, and if Carr got hurt here in these last 2 weeks, his contract, it would be fully guaranteed. New York Jets at the Seattle Seahawks. We have a revenge game. Geno Smith taking on the New York Jets. But hey, we're not here to talk about Geno Smith. We're here to talk about Mike White. He is back just in time to save your fantasy football championship aspirations. As long as those aspirations include Garrett Wilson and Elijah Moore. It's no secret. Too many Wilsons, it's a bad thing. Garrett's numbers without Zach, 9.2 first read targets per game, 10.3 targets per contest, 19.3 fantasy points per game, and 91.5 yards per game. Now, Tyreek Woolen there, a potential defensive player of the year, he is going to be man up there on Garrett Wilson much of this contest with Sauce Gardner, another defensive rookie of the year candidate there watching. You have to love that. The battle for LA, Los Angeles Rams at the Los Angeles Chargers, and definitely keep an eye on this. I didn't mention Austin Eckler's name in the injury report. That is a name that has surfaced in recent days. Now, it looks as though that Eckler is going to be that top scoring back in PPR scoring this year, which would be the first for a 27-year-old back in basically NFL history. Now, Eckler, he joins Hall of Famer Marshall Faulk there as the only players in NFL history to have 10 or more rushing touchdowns and 5 or more receiving touchdowns in consecutive seasons. Meanwhile, the other back on the other sideline, he is coming off a 3-touchdown performance just a week ago, and you have to like Cam Akers' matchup this week, facing the Chargers unit that has given up the 9th most rushing yards, 399 in the last 4 weeks, and the 2nd most on the season. And finally, Monday Night Football, we have the Buffalo Bills at the Cincinnati Bengals, 2 MVP candidates. They battled it out looking for their MVP moment there on Monday Night Football as Josh Allen and the Bills, they head into Cincinnati to take on the Joe Burrow-led Bengals. Allen, he's on pace to do something that no other quarterback has ever done in NFL history. That is throw for over 4,000 yards and toss 30 touchdowns. and run for 700 yards and run for 7 more touchdowns. Yet somehow he isn't even the favorite to win the MVP this season because that's how good Patrick Mahomes has been. Now let's talk about some of these games that I want to really get into, and that starts with the Miami Dolphins at the New England Patriots. We've got ourselves some serious playoff implications here on the line. The Patriots, they're on the outside looking in. The Miami Dolphins, they are clinging to that final AFC playoff spot right now. A loss here for the Dolphins doesn't exactly end their season, but it doesn't do them any favors. Now, the biggest news out of Miami, it appears to be that Teddy Bridgewater will once again be under center for the Dolphins when they head into New England on New Year's Day. Now, Bridgewater, his last start, he would end up going 23 of 34 for 329 yards in a 24-16 loss to the Minnesota Vikings back on October 16th. In that game, Bridgewater would throw for a pair of touchdowns there along with a couple interceptions. But those who are rostering Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle, they don't care about no stinking interceptions. Then again, both those touchdowns, they went to Mike Gesicki. Now, looking out for Tagovailoa may be in the Dolphins' best interest, not only sitting him out this week, but next week against the Jets as well. Miami, like I said, they need to win one of these final 2 contests to punch their ticket into the postseason. But considering this is likely Tagovailoa's 3rd concussion in as many months, I would hope that the team would err on the side of precaution and protect Tua from himself. Now, regardless of whomever is under center, both Hill and Waddle, they're going to find a way to produce. It's really that simple. Hill will likely draw Marcus Jones much of this contest there, who is allowing a very respectable 0.33 fantasy points per route run this season. While Hill, he's averaging 0.69. Now, we know that Hill and Waddle, they move around this formation. They like to shake things up. So Jonathan Jones will also need to be very aware of where Tyreek Hill and Waddle are lining up. Waddle himself is averaging 0.55 fantasy points per route run this season. So you've got 2 guys averaging more than half a fantasy point per route run, running routes at the same time. Now, per Graham Barfield there in his Week 17 stat pack over on fantasypoints.com, Hill has out-targeted Waddle 108-68 across the last 10 games in which they've played together. But Waddle continues to be one of the game's most underrated players. Waddle and Hill are the only receivers that rank top 5 in yards per route run when they run out wide and run out of the slot. Now, Jeff Wilson, he returned and took a slight lead in the backfield last week, seeing 9 carries to Raheem Mostert's 8, while Wilson played 60% of the snaps to Mostert's 52%. On the New England side of things here, the Patriots, they need this game as badly as the Dolphins do, if not even more, to keep their playoff hopes alive. The AFC playoff picture is getting crowded. There are several teams there knocking on the Dolphins' door for that last playoff spot. If the Patriots hope to win this week, they are going to need to find a way to score. And I'm not talking about field goals here. Since week number 9, the Patriots have the lowest touchdown conversion percentage there in the NFL, scoring a touchdown on just 11.3% of their drives. The red zone, it hasn't been much better for them here, as they are scoring on just 14.9% of their red zone plays, which is also a league worst. I planted my flag on Jacoby Myers beginning of last season there. Even after that lateral to Chandler Jones that cost the Patriots there a win against the Raiders, I stood by my guy. Now heading into week number 17, Myers sits 33rd amongst wide receivers this season in fantasy points per game, averaging 12.6 PPR points in those contests. That's more than Gabriel Davis, DJ Moore, and Cortland Sutton, all of whom were selected much earlier in redraft leagues back in August. Now, Myers, he is set to become a free agent at season's end, and outside of Ramondre Stevenson has been the only bit of offense the Patriots team has had all season, accounting for 17.8% of a target share and 24% of the air yards for the Patriots this year. Myers, 58 catches. That trails just Stevenson's 62 for the Patriots lead, and he also leads the team in targets with 80 and yards with 723. Now, speaking of Stevenson, the bruising back has 1,328 yards this year and is just 58 yards shy of 1,000 yards rushing this season. And he also happens to be facing a Dolphins defense that has allowed 30.9 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, which is the 3rd highest total in the NFL, while allowing 566 total yards and 6 touchdowns to the position over that time frame. Now, Marcus Jones, he is the X factor in this game. Not only is he responsible for trying to contain Tyreek Hill, but Jones now has a receiving touchdown, a punt return touchdown, an interception return touchdown, and he's done this all as a rookie. Only one player in the Super Bowl era has scored a 40-yard touchdown in each of those ways throughout their entire career there. And that's Mr. Primetime himself there, Deion Sanders, and that is per NFL research. The only Patriots with more touchdowns this season than Marcus Jones is Ramondre Stevenson, who has 6, and Jacoby Myers, who has 4. Now we head to the NFC South. I mean, the South divisions here in the NFL are horrible. From the AFC to the NFC, they are both very poor divisions. In fact, not one team has a record better than 500. But here we are. We're talking about a first-place showdown between the Buccaneers and the Carolina Panthers. One reason that Panthers find themselves in this battle for the top spot in the NFC South is Baker Mayfield is no longer under center, and also because Sam Darnold has led this Panthers to a 3-1 record since he took over. Last week against the Lions, Darnold, he would throw for 250 yards and throw for a touchdown while adding a second touchdown on the ground to produce 20 fantasy points in a contest for the first time since I don't even know when. But Darnold, he missed the first matchup way back on October 23rd. On that day, it was P.J. Walker who led this Panthers team to a 21-3 victory, completing just 16 of 22 passes for 177 yards and 2 touchdowns. One of them happened to go to DJ Moore, who had 7 catches on 10 targets for 69 yards. The other went to Tommy Tremble. You have to believe that Chuba Hubbard, who has now got 65 yards in 3 straight contests there, and Dante Foreman, they're not going to combine for 290 rushing yards again this week like they did against the Lions there in week number 16. It's even more likely that they both run for over 100 yards in the first half again. I mean, you know how significant that is? Prior to last week, the last time that was accomplished was in 2006 when Fred Taylor and Maurice Jones-Drew did that for the Jaguars against the Colts. Now, DJ Moore, he is the key contributor here for the Panthers. Moore is one player that needs to continue to be highly involved in this offense. Tampa Bay is allowing 35.9 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, which include 4 touchdowns and 572 yards to receivers. DJ Moore has averaged 0.42 fantasy points per route run this season while splitting his snaps equally basically on the boundary and out of the slot. And since Darnold's return, Moore has seen a 29% target share, which is 9th in the league, and a 57% air yard share, which is 1st, as well as 3 touchdowns in that short period of time. For Tampa Bay, back in that October meeting, Brady was held without a touchdown. That doesn't happen very often, but he did manage to throw for 290 yards. Then again, it took him 49 attempts to accomplish that. Now, since week number 8, the Buccaneers, they claim the worst turnover differential in the league at -7. And simply put, the Buccaneers, they have not been hitting big plays. They will need some big plays this week in order to beat Carolina. On the season, the Bucs are averaging 6.3 yards per touchdown play, which is only ahead of the Pittsburgh Steelers in that category. Meanwhile, last week, Brady averages 5.9 yards per attempt against the Cardinals. Per Scott Barrett and this week's usage report on fantasypoints.com, last week, Leonard Fournette, he turned 20 carries into 72 rushing yards and 10 targets into 90 receiving yards. He finished the week 2nd in expected fantasy points there at 24.6 and 3rd in fantasy points scored at 25.2. Fournette, he handled at least 60% of the team's backfield expected fantasy points over the last 2 weeks, up from 46% over the prior 3 games. Over this span, he is averaging 16 carries, 6.5 targets, and 19 expected fantasy points per game, which is RB2 range, and 18.3 fantasy points per game, which is RB5. That's pretty good for a 27-year-old running back who is playing through a Liz Frank injury. Again, that is per Scott Barrett there at fantasy points. Now, will Tampa Bay continue to alternate these drives between Rachaad White and Leonard Fournette this week? I'd like to say that they're going to go with a hot hand, but neither Fournette or White has done much in the run game as they rank 39th and 48th, I guess, respectively, in creating yards after contact per carry this season. That said, Fournette, he is coming off a game in which he saw a season-high 29 touches and produced 72 yards on 20 rushing attempts. Now, perhaps, I'm not saying this is happening, but maybe playoff Lenny is starting to wake up. Carolina, over the last 4 weeks, they are allowing just 13.4 fantasy points per game, which is the lowest total in the NFL, and have allowed just 211 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns to backs in those 4 contests. Another week, we continue the Mike Evans watch as he continues to creep closer and closer to 1,000 yards this season, which would extend his NFL record to 9 consecutive 1,000-yard seasons to start his career. Right now, he is 83 yards shy of that mark. Evans, he's missed some time this year. He's only played in 14 games, so I'm going to cut him a little bit of a break that he's got basically until week 18 to get that job done. I'm not going to throw up an asterisk if he takes another week to get to that goal. Now, he's going to need to be more productive than he has been in recent weeks, as he has failed to hit 60 yards receiving in 6 of his last 7 contests. Chris Godwin is the captain now as far as his passing game is concerned, seeing 8 or more targets in each of the last 10 games and producing 60 yards or more in 5 of the last 6 contests. Now we talk about from one area there to another huge playoff matchup. This time we turn our attention to the NFC North, where we have the Minnesota Vikings heading into Lambeau Field to take on Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers. For Minnesota, Kirk Cousins has to be liking the way that this offense is starting to shape up, especially after the trade that brought TJ Hawkinson over. Justin Jefferson, he's still getting his. He sits just 208 yards shy of tying Calvin Johnson's single-season receiving record. Jefferson has recorded 180 yards or more in a single game 3 times this season, including a 233-yard performance against the Lions back on December 11th. One of those 180-plus yard performances that came against this Packers secondary back in week number 1, where Jefferson would go on to haul in 9 of 11 targets for 184 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, Green Bay, they run primarily zone coverage, which I wouldn't really recommend doing against Justin Jefferson. They do this on about 74% of the passing plays. But if the Packers say, hey, you know what, we don't like Jefferson finding the soft spots in their zone, they decide to play some man coverage against Jefferson, I don't think it's going to matter if it's Jair Alexander or Rasul Douglas there, as Jefferson leads the NFL in yards versus man-to-man coverage with 710, which is 122 more than the next closest receiver, who happens to be A.J. Brown. Now, Cousins sits 5th in the NFL with 4,117 passing yards and is tied with Geno Smith for 4th in passing touchdowns with 27, while his 11 interceptions are fewer than Josh Allen, fewer than Joe Burrow. And yet, Cousins, he doesn't even get into that MVP conversation, even though his numbers say, hey, you know what? We should probably consider this guy. I mean, I guess he shops at Old Navy and stuff, but hey, I respect that. I respect Kirk Cousins' swag game. But let's take a closer look at why Kirk Cousins really deserves to be considered in that MVP conversation. Most fourth quarter comebacks and game-winning drives this season, he's got 8 of those, 1,416 passing yards, 13 touchdowns, so only 3 interceptions in the fourth quarter. Just for comparison's sake, the likely NFL MVP, Patrick Mahomes, he only has 1,107 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions in the fourth quarter this season. So if you're looking for a fourth quarter quarterback here, I'm thinking Kirk Cousins has the advantage over Patrick Mahomes. Now, TJ Hawkinson, now he's looking to be like a real league winner right now as we enter Fantasy Football Championship week. On the season, the Packers have allowed 7 receiving touchdowns to the tight end position. And looking at the fantasy points market report there for week number 17, Joe Dolan points out that Hawkinson is coming off the single biggest tight end performance of the entire season there in week number 17, putting up 39.9 fantasy points against the Giants as part of his 13-catch, 109-yard, 2-touchdown performance on 16 targets. He has been an absolute stud since being traded to the Vikings before week number 9. On the season, he has scored more total fantasy points than every tight end not named Travis Kelce. And since arriving in Minnesota, only Kelce has outscored him, while no tight end has more catches than Hawkinson's 52. Hawkinson, he has been targeted at least 6 times in every game since he's been a Viking and has overtaken Adam Thielen as Kirk Cousins' number 1 target behind Justin Jefferson. Again, that's per the Fantasy Points Week 17 market report and Joe Dolan. For Green Bay, I have some bad news for Vikings fans. When that calendar it flips to December, the weather gets a little bit colder, and Aaron Rodgers, he simply does not lose. In fact, he is now 15-0 in December once Matt LaFleur became the Packers head coach, throwing 32 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, posting a 103.7 rate. What? Okay, I guess technically now it's January. Like when this game takes place, it's January 1st. So you can throw those whole December stats away, right? I mean, really? New year, new Aaron Rodgers. This season, Rodgers is averaging a career low 221.1 passing yards per game there, and is averaging just 6.8 yards per attempt, which is his lowest mark since 2015. Now, I want to believe that this is a matchup in which Aaron Rodgers can do right by fantasy managers facing a Vikings defense that has allowed 1,215 yards passing and 5 touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. That said, if you go back to that week 1 contest, Rodgers, he was held to just 195 passing yards on 22 of 34 against the same Vikings secondary that has struggled all season and giving it out to just about every quarterback all season long. Now, the weather outside is heading into negative temperatures, so the Packers have turned to A.J. Dillon to get this run game going. Look, there's going to be business decisions made anytime you start hitting those sub-zero temperatures. When you see a man built the way that A.J. Dillon is built, reaching that second level, tackling, it feels a little bit different when you're a little bit cold. Now, looking at the last 3 weeks, Aaron Jones has seen just 29%, 49%, and again, 29% of the Packers rushing attempts. Now, that 49% clip, A.J. Dillon was dealing with a concussion there. Now, while Dillon, he has 5 touchdowns in the last 4 contests, is something else you need to keep in mind. When they get close to that red zone, get close to scoring time, it's A.J. Dillon. Last week in Miami, Dillon led the Packers backfield in carries and scrimmage yards and snap share there, 58% to 38%. One problem with the cold weather, it is not forgiving when you are dealing with or working through injuries, much like the hip flexor that is currently bothering rookie sensation Christian Watson. Watson has seen at least 6 targets in each of the last 8 contests in which he's played. In those 8 games, he has 408 of his 496 receiving yards, and he's got 7 touchdown grabs to go along with that. If Watson were limited this week, which he has been so far heading into Friday, or unavailable, then Romeo Doubs there looks to benefit the most against this Vikings team that is allowing like almost just under 50 fantasy points per game. I think it's about 47, right around that range over the last 4 contests, not to mention the second most yards allowed to receivers at 892. And our final matchup that we're talking about, how about the Pittsburgh Steelers at the Baltimore Ravens, a little AFC North matchup here, as Mike Tomlin, you know he's going to have his guys ready, or at least they look like that against the Raiders. And again, the Raiders, they kind of make a lot of teams look like they're getting ready to go. Now, Najee Harris, he carried the ball 16 times for just 53 yards, but he added 42 more yards on 6 receptions. Pat Fairmouth, he would have 7 catches there for 66 yards while earning a 22% target share in his return from injury, while Deontay Johnson, he had 5 catches for 64 yards, and George Pickens would have 5 catches, 57 yards, and the Steelers' lone touchdown. Now, while targets and receptions seemed to be divided fairly evenly last week, Harris remains the focal point of the Steelers' backfield, accounting for 73% of the running back opportunity share in week number 16. I think it's safe to say that Jaylen Warren is going to be a non-factor for championship weekend here. The key to this game for fantasy managers is figuring out which Steeler receiver is going to be the most productive. If the Ravens run single man coverage, this is going to benefit Deontay Johnson, who is getting open against this coverage 47.9% of the time, which is inside the top 10. I believe it's the 6th best mark for wide receivers. Whereas George Pickens, he has struggled to get open against single man coverage, doing so just 24.9% of the time. Now, the one thing that catches my eye when I go some box score surfing here inside the Pittsburgh Steelers stat line is that George Pickens, he has 3 touchdowns on 47 receptions. Okay, it is what it is. But Deontay Johnson has 82 receptions this season and still does not have a touchdown to show for it. I think it was Raymond Berry who had the single season mark in futility and hauling in 75 passes there without a touchdown back in 1961. Now, back in week number 14, which was not quite as far back as 1961, Mitch Trubisky, he was under center in this contest, at least for a majority of the game, and he would end up going 22 of 30 for 276 yards and a touchdown. He would also throw 3 interceptions in that game. Now, Harris was basically eliminated from producing anything fantasy-wise. He was held to basically 2.8 yards per carry. However, the trio of Steelers pass catchers, they would all go on to record double-digit fantasy production on that day. Pat Fairmouth there, he would be the lone recipient of a Steelers touchdown, and he would finish with 3 catches for 33 yards along with that touchdown. While Johnson, he caught 6 of 8 targets, most of which was coming against Marlon Humphrey for 82 yards, while rookie Pickens, he caught all 3 of his targets for 78 yards. Now, Marlon Humphrey's probably the primary reason why this Ravens secondary has looked much better the back half of the season. It seems they've got things right. Now, for the rest of the Baltimore Ravens, Lamar Jackson, he is still not being spotted at practice. He's still not taking reps. You know what? Who can blame him? He's got no financial guarantee beyond this season. And if he's less than 100%, why would he go out there on the field? Especially being a mobile quarterback dealing with a PCL sprain, there is a huge risk of potentially harming himself even further. And that risk, it's too great for both the Ravens and the player to take a chance on. Now, Baltimore, they're already in the postseason. They've already booked their ticket. And we know that Tyler Snoop Huntley has already proven to be a capable backup when called upon. Huntley may only be averaging 105 passing yards per game, but like Jackson, his value comes in his ability to pick up yards with his legs, which is great for him, not so great for the rest of these Ravens pass catchers here. You have to go back beyond 4 weeks to find a game in which Huntley had more than 175 yards passing, and that was in a 10-9 victory over the Broncos. Mark Andrews would haul in 4 passes for 53 yards, while Demarcus Robinson, he chipped in with 41 yards on 7 receptions. Now, over the last 4 weeks, the Steelers, they have been tough on opposing quarterbacks, limiting them to 654 passing yards and 4 touchdowns, while allowing them just 64 yards on the ground. Now, we can expect Mark Andrews to be that primary recipient there of those Tyler Huntley passes this week, as the Steelers, they are allowing just over 9 fantasy points per game to the position over the last month. But I expect this matchup to be our best against your best type slugfest between two AFC North rivals. That means a Steelers defense that is surrendering the second fewest fantasy points to running backs over the last 4 weeks, squaring off against this running back three-headed monster here that the Ravens have in a rushing attack that consists of both Tyler Huntley, J.K. Dobbins, and Gus Edwards. Against the Falcons last week, that trio, they would run for 184 yards, led by Gus Edwards, 99 yards on 11 carries. The week prior, it was Dobbins who was responsible for 125 of the Ravens' 195 rushing yards. And then back on December 11th, when these teams last met, Dobbins would finish with 120 yards on 15 carries. Edwards would chip in there, carrying the ball 13 times for 66 yards. And Huntley, he would add 31 more yards on the ground on 9 attempts in that Ravens 16-14 victory in Pittsburgh. With that all being said, hey, those are the games that I'm excited about. Those are the matchups inside the matchups that I want to see. What do you want to see here in week number 17? What do you need to win a fantasy championship? What are you hoping for? Well, if you're not too sure yet and you're not quite got those lineups set, make sure to take a second, head to fantasypoints.com, get a subscription. If you sign up anytime before the Super Bowl, you are going to get yourself 30% off that subscription for next year, and the rest of the season is going to be included in that. How about you check out the lineup that we have on the YouTube channel here? That's right. We've got free content here on the Fantasy Points YouTube channel, starting on Mondays there with Wes Huber and the Monday grades. That's coming at you at 9 a.m. Eastern. Tuesdays, plugged in DFS review with Scott Baird and JM to Win. You can expect that to be dropping at about 2 p.m. Eastern. Wednesdays, we have the midweek mailbag there with Nick's script. That's coming at you every single weekend. Get those questions into Nick. He's here to help you win today. And of course, Tuesdays through Fridays, the daily lineup with Joe Dolan. Hey, you got 10 minutes to spare. Joe Dolan, he's got you covered for every kind of information that you need for fantasy football for that day. And of course, you know what today is. It's Friday. It's time to get hyped for the weekend. Let's go out there and win ourselves some fantasy championships. Let's get that belt and let's show it off to the world. We'll see you next time.